Hey everybody, today I want to talk about some of the most popular annuals and cover maybe why they're good options for your garden, but also address some of the kind of shortcomings of each of these plants and give you some solutions that might kind of overcome some of those difficulties that people often have with those plants. And I'm going to speak specifically from my own experience. I'm intentionally not doing like heavy research. I'm not going and doing internet searches. I'm just trying to speak specifically from what I've had experience with and the people kind of that I interact with. So remember, I am growing in northern Michigan, so there might be a couple things that are specific to here, but because these are annuals, usually most of these suggestions are going to work no matter where you are. But I will say, like if you're in a really hot or really humid area or an area with specific like pests or diseases, that's going to really change things up for you. So you're going to want to look locally for specific advice on those. But ultimately, I think a lot of this advice is pretty universal for anybody who's trying to grow a lot of these plants. So I'm going to go from A to V. So first one is Angelonia, and this is a plant that is so underrated and underused, at least in our area it is, and it's so easy to grow. It's in the snapdragon family, so it gets these nice tall stalks of flowers. Doesn't get the same colors as snapdragons, but beautiful colors that are available, and it's one of those where the flowers last a really long time. So it's one of those that just keeps blooming and blooming, and you get just really good flower coverage. It has a little bit of a fragrance that the deer don't like, which that's something that I love because I don't have to worry about the deer eating it. But the downfall with it tends to be that it's a bit of a slow starter, so it prefers like the heat. So when people are coming into the garden center early in the season and they're being all kind of drawn by the Calibrachoa and the Petunias and all their bright blooms, they often overlook the Angelonia because the Angelonia is just kind of hanging out waiting for those kind of warmer nights and those hot days, and so it doesn't, stand on the bench early in the season and scream, buy me. So a lot of people just skip it. But I'm gonna tell you this, once you get into the warmer weather, that thing just takes off. It keeps, just this beautiful kind of bunches of flowers all season long, goes right till frost. So it's such a nice plant to have. Problem that I have, so I got really enamored with the really tall Angelonia. So like the Proven Winners ones, the angel face ones, and the angel face super ones, those get like 20 inches or higher, and they're really big and really cool, and that's what I wanted, was I want the most dramatic ones. But I did always find there was always that one branch that was kind of leaning or kind of falling over, and it still looked okay. It would kind of find its way back up and it would be fine, but not exactly the look I was going for. So in that situation, what I would recommend is as soon as you notice it, if you cut it off, you're going to encourage that growth upwards. But the other thing that's happened more recently is I've fallen in love with those shorter varieties, the more 14 to 18 inch, and there are shorter than that even, but I like those 14 to 18 inch ones. They keep their habit really nice. They have more flowers actually, I think in most cases, than some of the angel face or the big tall ones. So I like that about it, and they're just such beautiful plants, and so that usually solves that problem. Just go a little, in that different height range, and it solved that problem for me completely. The other thing about Angelonia is that there are some trailing varieties, and I love these trailing varieties. They tend to be more like, they grow more like a Scaevola or maybe more like a lobelia kind of look to them, and they kind of do, I call it the Gidget, so they kind of go up over the pot and then down, and then they flare back up, so kind of like Gidget's hairdo, for those of you who remember who Gidget is. And so it's just, those are really nice as well, completely different habit, but they do really well. So Angelonia, completely underrated. So begonias, and begonias, traditionally people only think of begonias for shade, and they don't realize that there are so many varieties that can take sun or shade, or the ones that maybe can take everything but full sun or everything but full shade. And so you do want to kind of keep an eye out for that, because they're a lot more versatile than people kind of realize. And they're known for having just those beautiful flowers, and they tend to have really nice foliage as well. They just nice looking plants. But there are some problems that some people have. Some people just don't have any luck with them. Most common thing is people come in and say, I planted it and it just kind of sat there, it didn't do anything, or it kind of started getting kind of rotting and things came off. What causes that is usually overwatering. So begonia is one of those plants that does not like to go into wet soil. So the roots like to just kind of sit there. If there's wet soil, they will not go into that area. That then causes some root rot. Also, if there's too much moisture, you can get like the stems will just kind of rot off and die. And once that happens, like once a begonia doesn't have any leaves, they tend to just die. They don't, bounce back, or they won't send up new shoots. If there are some leaves left, they usually do recover, but that's kind of, you don't want to be in that situation. So we tend to keep our begonias more on the dry side. We don't let them completely dry out, but we don't keep them very wet at all. Now, if you want a begonia that's kind of the bulletproof one, the one that can take tons of abuse and you don't have to worry about it too much, usually the wax begonias are the ones for that. So like the Surefires, Dragon Wings, Whoppers, there's like Viking, another one's called Big, all these different kinds. They can usually take full sun, full shade, so they're very forgiving on that front. They can handle quite a bit of drought, and they usually behave even, with water issues and that type of thing, and we don't usually have problems with diseases. The only thing I want to really point out is that with any of your sun or shade plants, if it starts in kind of a shady spot and you're moving it to a sunny spot, and so a lot of times like in a greenhouse or a shopping environment, it might not be in full hot afternoon sun, and then you take it home, it can get sunburned if you put it in that hot afternoon sun. So you want to acclimate it. So that usually means, put it outside for an hour or two in the hot sun, but then move it to the shade, and then the next day give it a little more time and a little bit more, or start it in a spot that gets a little break. That's what I'd recommend, because once those leaves get that scorch, they usually don't die, but it does take a while for that plant to recover, and it doesn't look good right away. So giving it that time to acclimate can make a really big difference if it's been in a shadier spot. Calibrachoa tend to be this festival of color, and there's so many different colors that are available, and they have great little patterns. There's just so many choices. The only complaint that people usually give is that, it looked good for like a month or two, and then it just kind of went downhill from there. There's a couple things that can cause that. So Calibrachoa tend to be a little more sensitive to soil pH than other plants. So if your soil pH isn't in the range that they like, they usually do fine at first because they have kind of that original soil that they're working through. But once the roots start going into anything else, they kind of have trouble. So that's why we don't recommend putting Calibrachoa in like the ground. We usually keep them in containers because you can control the pH much better in that kind of environment. The symptoms that you're going to notice, so first of all, the leaves kind of get kind of a weird color. So sometimes it's a little yellow, sometimes they have a little bit of a brown cast, and the leaves tend not to be that long. They get kind of nubby. They tend not to flower very much. So they don't die, but they just don't look good, and they're definitely not the Calibrachoa that you picture with this big, ball of flowers that kind of cascade over a pot. They kind of get these weird arms. It's not very attractive. So usually that's the most common issue. And the solution to that soil pH issue, like in a container, if we notice that, usually we'll give them a little bit of iron. So by giving them that iron, that will kind of, usually they'll recover, or they'll start being able to take nutrients again in like 2 days. So that little bit of iron just kind of changes everything for them. So we usually use like a product called High Yield, but there are other ones out there. It's pretty easy fix, but you do want to make sure that it is that pH or that iron deficiency that's causing that, because the other issue with Calibrachoa usually is watering. So if you put too much water in with a Calibrachoa, it does not like it at all. And you have to be really careful. If you notice like a Calibrachoa starting to wilt, people immediately think that it's dried out and needs more water. It oftentimes is exactly the opposite. It's getting too much water and it starts to wilt. So be really careful. Anytime your Calibrachoa isn't looking quite right, check your soil. Stick your finger in there, and if it's wet, let it dry down, because ideally the Calibrachoa like to have cycles of, where it's saturated soil and then dry it out. Saturated soil, dry it out. But I'm really cautious about recommending doing that, because when you let soil dry out in your containers, it can be really hard to get it rehydrated again. So usually to do that, you either have to add the water really gradually. So you add some water, come back in an hour, add some more water, come back in an hour, or you have to like submerge your pot like in a tub of water and let it kind of soak up over the course of an hour. And people just tend to not always be really good at that. So I usually just keep them kind of on a little bit of the dry side, and also make sure that you're fertilizing. So you always want to make sure that they're on a regular fertilizing schedule. Now for Coleus, and there aren't very many plants that give you the color and patterns that Coleus give you on their foliage. They just keep coming out with more and more and more colors and patterns. It's absolutely stunning, and it's a relatively easy plant to grow, and it's available in a lot of sizes, so do pay attention to that. So you can get, kind of grapefruit size Coleus all the way up to ones that get easily up to 3 feet. So you want to be careful about kind of that sizing, because a lot of times if you plant them too close, and let's say you plant it too close and you have it close to the house and there's not much air circulation, they can have trouble with kind of getting either moldy or kind of the leaves kind of falling off and having trouble with that. So you want to make sure that they're getting that little bit of air circulation. It's going to protect them. It's going to make sure that the stems are nice and healthy as well, because if those get too much moisture, they can often kind of rot out a little bit, kind of like that Begonia does. I don't notice it as much with some of the newer varieties, and I don't notice it quite as much with when they're spaced out more, so it's not as much of a problem, but I have seen that happen. The other thing about Coleus is that it responds really well to trimming. So if it's kind of growing in a direction that you don't want, or you want to contain it a little bit more, it's pretty easy to pinch it. You just look where, there's usually 2 leaf sets, that come off. You just pinch it and it'll just start growing from that point. You don't want to go all the way down to the trunk. You want to make sure that there are, usually we say 2 leaf sets, but sometimes you don't have a choice but leaving 1. It still usually responds pretty well to that, but easy plant and big impact on those as well. Next up is the lowly geranium. At least that's some people's attitude. I have a lot of respect for the geranium because that's one of those plants that seems to thrive on neglect. So the newer varieties do get a lot more blooms. The flower umbels are really huge and they last a really long time. And so they're kind of a no-brainer for me. The big thing that I find with geraniums is that people don't realize how little water they need. You can let them stay dry for 1, 2, maybe even 3 days and they don't even show any signs of stress. And the great thing about that, like for us, if we wanted a geranium to bloom, we stop giving it water. So like when we need them to bloom for like Mother's Day, the week before, we kind of starve them. We don't give them any water, and that usually forces them, they kind of go, uh-oh, there's trouble, I better send up some flowers. And so that's one of the things that people really underestimate with a geranium. Now, ultimately, geraniums do fine too if you just keep them, you know, kind of regularly moist, so you don't have to dry them out. But the only downfall is that they do benefit from some deadheading because the spent blooms can look a little rough. Advice that I have on that, if you go with a darker flower, usually you don't notice the spent blooms quite as soon. When you have a white or a really light pink, a lot of times they turn brown and it's pretty obvious that they're spent flowers. There are also, like I've seen 2 varieties, the Caliente and the Caldera. Those are 2 varieties that are self-cleaning. I'm saying semi-self-cleaning because you'll still notice the spent blooms, but they have a different type of flower. It's a much airier bloom. And so they have, I think it's called the bracts. Are those the little, there's the stem and then those little bracts that the petals stay on. I think that's what it's called. What happens with those varieties is that the petals dry up and just disappear. They blow off, and then you just have the bracts, which kind of look like a little bit like a spent allium. It actually isn't too bad looking. And then eventually those bracts fall off, and then eventually the stem falls off. So it is semi-self-cleaning. It's one of those that you don't really notice those spent blooms quite as much. So that would be a variety to check if you're one of those people where I've got a spot that I don't want to have to clean or do any kind of deadheading on. You know, that I'd recommend one of those 2, Caliente and Caldera. Euphorbia is one of those plants that people don't know about, and boy, if you started putting that in some of your combos, you will be very surprised because number one, it doesn't need much attention. It just does its thing. We've had it in kind of dry containers and it's done fine. We've had it in somewhat wet containers and it's done pretty good as well. It just kind of holds up against everything, and it's definitely just a filler plant. It is not showy in any way, but it is one of those plants that will elevate things. Put it in with a geranium or a begonia and you will be surprised at how fantastic it looks. It just creates just like a little cloud for the flowers to kind of hang out above. It really is attractive. It's super easy. Next up is Ipomea. Some people pronounce it Ipomea. Sweet potato vine. So this is the one where beautiful colors. It's usually the trailing varieties that people think of, and it's just a beautiful color display. It's usually a pretty easy plant. It does tend to like the heat, so you don't want it to get too cold. So don't put it outside too early. A lot of times then they kind of go into, I'm going to say like a dormant stage. They just kind of sit there and wait for the heat to come back. So you don't want to lose any momentum that, like if they're growing in the greenhouse and they're looking really good and then you stick them where it's really, really cold, then they just kind of sit there. So, you know, that's just my advice on that one. Also, they respond really well to trimming. So if they're getting too big or if they're growing in areas you don't want them to grow, just cut them off and they'll come back. And now the varieties that aren't trailing, they're more mounding, those you can still trim those up. They respond really well to it. They can be a little trickier because you're not getting, you know, the long trailing arm that you're cutting off. You're kind of just getting in there and getting it, and it might look like it has a bald spot, but that usually only lasts a couple days and it starts sending up new stuff. So don't panic about it. Just make sure you leave some leaves for them, because if you cut them right down and there's nothing for them to be able to get the sunlight and the energy that way, then they don't respond well, or it can take a really long time. But give them just little trims here and there, no problem at all. Lantana was one that wasn't very common up by us for a long time, and I think part of it is because it is a warm weather plant. It's another one of those that kind of sits tight until it warms up, and then it puts on a show, and you can't beat all the colors of the Lantana. Just really intense colors are available. A lot of them kind of change color as the flower ages too, and it's like really nice colors. So they start a nice color and then they turn to an even cooler color a lot of times. So it's a really good one to have. Pretty easy to grow for the most part as well. But the only thing with that one is that, like the other older varieties, tended to kind of go in and out of flower, and so if you weren't deadheading them, they wouldn't necessarily bloom all the time. A lot of these new sterile varieties are incredible because they just don't stop blooming. I'm really fond of the Bandolista series and the Luscious series from Proven Winners. Both those are really strong performers. There's a lot of other ones too that do great, but man, those two, they are quite vigorous though, so you do want to be careful that you're not putting it with something that is going to kind of take over. They also have kind of a really unusual lemony scent, so it's a nice smell. I think some people might not like it, but I like it, but the deer don't like it. So that's the other advantage to having those. And hummingbirds are big fanatics of going from the Lantana plants and kind of going around. I'm going to talk about Lisianthus, even though it's not really that common of a plant. There aren't a lot of places that sell it. We've had it for years, and we have a lot of customers that are very loyal. We haven't been able to have it for the last 2 years because there was kind of a growing situation that changed that we weren't able to carry it, but we're bringing it back this year, and it's so worth bringing up because it's such a beautiful plant, and it kind of almost has like rose-like flowers, and as a cut flower, those blooms last like 2 weeks easily. It's amazing how once you put them in water, they just look great for such a long time. What we do with our Lisianthus though is usually half of them we pinch or we trim them, so we get 2 leaf sets and then we trim them, and then the other ones we leave. And the reason why we do that is to stagger the bloom times. So the ones that we trim will then be more branching and they'll have more blooms. Meanwhile, the single one will bloom a little bit earlier. Usually that single one will then bloom, and when we trim it, we'll get a second flush on it. That's the case with us anyway. And then the other ones we may or may not get that second flush, but usually the different arms that kind of come off of where we trimmed it bloom at a little bit different time. So we tend to get a pretty good length of time for blooms on our Lisianthus. If you just kind of grow them and they're all kind of the same, sometimes that window can be a little narrower. There are early, middle, and late blooming Lisianthus. We tend to stick to the early or the middle because the late ones tend to come too late for us and there's no chance of a second bloom. So that's how we do it, and it's worked out well for us. Now, petunias are those flower machines. Those are the ones that get so big and get so many blooms, especially these new hybrid varieties like the Supertunias and a lot of the other ones that are out there. They just do so well and they're so beautiful, but there are some downfalls. So first of all, people who aren't having some of these hybrids get a little disappointed because they look great for a certain amount of time and then they kind of dwindle. And that's because they tend to go to seed. So if you're not deadheading some of those like the grandiflora and multiflora varieties, you won't get the long-term blooms. So they can be a little bit more work. Meanwhile, these more sterile varieties that are hybrids, those things will just keep going and going and going right till frost. Biggest thing that happens is like people say, it kind of dwindled, or I got a hole in the middle where there weren't any flowers. Usually that means it's not getting either enough sunlight or it's not getting enough fertilizer. And petunias are heavy feeders, so they like the water-soluble fertilizer, like a Miracle-Gro, they like it every single week. And it is one of those plants where if you keep giving it lots of food, it will keep blooming and blooming and blooming. So you have to keep up on the fertilizing if you want petunias that have that big showy appearance. Meanwhile, plants like the Begonias, the Impatiens, the Coleus, those we fertilize half as much as a petunia, even less. So those we might go every other week or every like third week even. But with petunias, we're pretty diligent about making sure it's every single week. Scaevola is another one of those plants that you really need to consider, but people miss out on it because it tends to wait a little while before it puts on its show. So, you know, when you're in the garden center, like here, if you're here in May, Scaevola doesn't look like much, but by the time we get into June, that thing is just gorgeous. By the time we get to July, it's fantastic. It does the gidget, so it goes up and down and flares back up, and lots of blooms on it. It buries its dead if you get the right varieties. Like we really love the Surdiva variety, but there's a lot of other ones out there that are fantastic. There are compact varieties and vigorous varieties, so make sure you know which one you're looking at. So look at those sizes so that it kind of matches up with the plants you're putting it with, but no brainer. Buries its dead, so it always is in bloom. It can take complete drought, so it can totally dry out. It can even look dead, give it water again, and it usually bounces right back. So easy, and it's so forgiving, and it kind of just keeps going and going and going. My last plant is Verbena, and I just love the flowers on these. They come in really great colors as well, so it's a really nice one. The only problem that people tend to have is that sometimes Verbena goes in and out of flower, and it requires deadheading to kind of encourage new flowers. But I did find that if you keep it kind of consistently moist and you give it a good amount of fertilizer, it usually keeps producing and producing. So that can solve that problem. Also, we've had a lot easier time growing with the Superbenas. They tend to not go out of flower as long as they're getting that fertilizer. Now, it is a drought-tolerant plant, so we had it in one of our drought-tolerant containers, and we were going at the beginning of the season like 2 weeks without water, and they were doing just fine. The only thing is when you stress them out with the water, they tend to stop producing flowers, and that's, then they bounce back. As soon as you give them water and fertilizer, suddenly they're full of flowers again, but it was basically stressing them out that causes them not to flower. So if you keep them just kind of calm and happy, they do great. So Verbena's another good one. So if you stuck with me all the way to this point, I'm guessing you probably got some information that was useful to you. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope that I gave you some good suggestions, and I'm going to make you a little bit more successful with those annuals. I would encourage you, if you know kind of a tip or a secret for any of the plants that I mentioned or any other common plants, go ahead and leave them in the comments. You guys have been really good about giving me suggestions, definitely changing kind of some of the attitudes that I have about certain plants and what I want to grow and how I'm going to grow them. So keep up the good work, and I will see you guys all in the next video.